Greetings, colleagues. This presentation will overview my research on the topic of giftedness in the elementary school, with a particular emphasis on the various ways in which children may exhibit gifted behaviors. When I proposed my topic to Dr. Baker, he and I both noted it as being immediately applicable to my current situation. I serve as a gifted resource support teacher for grades K through 5 in a large district just north of Pittsburgh. My particular school draws from the lowest socioeconomic strata of our district. Once I got started, there were several ways that I considered the general topic of giftedness in the elementary school, but I ultimately elected a practical focus, namely the ways in which my colleagues and I at school do and do not recognize giftedness in our students. I intend for my research paper itself to take a more in-depth look at the historical and pedagogical considerations of this topic, along with citing specific research studies that evidence various aspects of it. By contrast, this presentation is a very high-level look at my findings because, like the reasons that prompted my selection of the topic to begin with, I am most immediately concerned with how my study may be impactful to my practice rather than being a more theoretical overview. Let's start with this kid, one we'd probably all easily identify as being profoundly gifted. He displayed unusual characteristics from an early age. He spoke his first word at 3 months, dada, could recite memorized books before the age of 1 year, and began to read to himself shortly thereafter. By the age of 2, he was correcting grammatical errors made by adults, and he had finished reading books including Journey to the Center of the Earth and The Last of the Mohicans. He was equally talented in mathematics. He began solving basic arithmetic problems at the age of 14 months, could do basic algebra by 5, and when he was 6, he was annoying his teachers by finding mistakes in the math textbooks and flagging them with Post-it notes. He completed his elementary school curriculum in about a year, and at age 7, he was enrolled in high school. He started his first year of college at 10, and by 13, had completed his bachelor's degree. But his giftedness is not limited to academics. He was also concerned with moral issues, a tendency often identified in children with exceptionally high IQs. When he was 9, he became greatly upset learning about childhood violence taking place around the globe. So in response, he founded 2 organizations, the World Children Awards, dedicated to addressing needs and rights of children, and the International Youth Advocates, focused on promoting principles of peace and understanding among young people throughout the world. Meet Greg Smith. He has now completed 4 doctorates, 1 in math, 1 in aerospace engineering, 1 in international relations, and 1 in biomedical research. He has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 5 times for the work he first started as a child, the 2 foundations dedicated to promoting nonviolence. Greg currently serves as a postdoctoral researcher at Mount Sinai, where he studies stochastic gene expression. He says that his simple goal is just to alleviate suffering by building better drugs. Here's another child we'd all recognize as being gifted. Considered a child prodigy, his IQ was measured at 170 plus. From a very early age, he understood complex math and science concepts at very advanced levels. As a preschooler, he taught himself to read, and from that point on was a precocious and voracious reader. Throughout elementary school, he was a model student, excelling in all subject areas. By the end of 5th grade, he had advanced through academics at a rate and pace that far exceeded that of his peers, so he skipped 6th grade. After finishing high school at age 16, he entered Harvard with a good scholarship. By age 25, he had completed his master's and doctoral degrees in mathematics at the University of Michigan, where he immediately received a tenured position at the University of California, Berkeley, teaching mathematics. But unlike Greg Smith's story, Theodore Kaczynski's does not have a happy ending. Within 2 years of starting at Berkeley, he suddenly resigned his position. He had become convinced that technology was taking over society and that human freedoms were being undermined by industry. By 1971, he was a Luddite survivalist, living alone in a Montana cabin without electricity or running water. 2 years later, he began a terrorist campaign that would eventually label him as the Unabomber. In 1996, he was convicted on 10 counts of illegally transporting, mailing, and using bombs, and 3 counts of murder. Ted currently serves 8 life sentences at a supermax prison in Colorado. This child was a school-age disaster. Late to acquire even the most basic of facts, he was a dreamer who seemed to exist in his own distracted world. A reluctant student at the best of times, he lagged behind his peers academically and socially, barely scraping by in grammar school. In fact, when he was 9 years old, his grades were among the worst in his class, and his teachers despaired that he would get through school, much less make it in the world. By the end of grade school, he plugged in a bit more and was able to get his grades up to C averages, but they feared he would never amount to anything. Despite his school failings, from an early age, he was very interested in how stuff worked, and he loved to take things apart, like clocks and radios. He was not, however, always very good at putting them back together, so they never really worked again. For this reason, those around him sensed his abilities, even as they doubted that he would ever be able to do anything with it. His nickname was Einstein. Stephen Hawking entered the University of Oxford at age 17, choosing to study math and physics. He completed his degrees in just under 3 years, finding the academic work, quote, ridiculously easy, end quote. He later estimated he had spent a grand total of about 1,000 hours of study time during the whole time he was at Oxford. He went on to complete doctoral studies at Cambridge, and despite his battle with ALS, until his recent death on Pi Day, he is largely considered to be one of the great thinkers of our age. His ideas have revolutionized our understandings of the universe as much as, perhaps even more so than those of Einstein, his nickname's sake. There is a take in my setting that my school psychologist often uses that claims, quote, if you've met one gifted kid, you've met one gifted kid, end quote. Well, you just met 3, and they could not have been more different. What do the diverse examples provided by David, Ted, and Stephen mean in terms of definition, manifestations, and identification of giftedness? Particularly since, as gifted resource support, I am the one who is supposed to consider it first and foremost in context. It is first important to acknowledge and understand the various terms in the field. Many programs, like mine, refer to their students as gifted, while others call their learners talented. The acronym GATE, or GATE, Gifted and Talented Education, includes both. When I was in North Carolina, we referred to the area holistically as AIG, or academically and intellectually gifted. So is there really a difference between gifted or talented and gifted and talented? And what is this thing, intellectual and academic, and are they distinctions? The term gifted reflects the kind of delineation most typical for schools. That is, identification of individuals based on an IQ score derived from an intelligence testing. This should not be surprising, given that there are many studies confirming the success of IQ test scores at globally producing and predicting school and job performance. In fact, the entire field of gifted education was first defined by the development of intelligence testing. Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, proposed the idea of the bell-shaped, or what we now know as the normal curve, to plot statistical data, and then demonstrated that physiological traits, and by his logic, psychological traits as well, could all be matched against it. In the early 20th century, Albert Binet and William Stern developed a mathematical formula that yielded the statistical measurement we now know as the intelligence quotient, or IQ. Perhaps the most famous early work around giftedness was that of Louis Terman, a psychologist at Stanford who conducted large-scale longitudinal work with high IQ children. Regardless, by the 1930s, assessments for and measures of IQ were firmly linked to understandings of giftedness, thus placing abilities of the gifted on the upper reaches of the normal curve, far above that of Galton's original description of, quote, average man, end quote. Currently, in the Commonwealth of PA, a score of 130 plus on any one section of an IQ assessment instrument denotes a child as gifted, and qualifies him or her for gifted services. Another important distinction we need to make is that between two adjectives linked to giftedness: intellectual giftedness and academic giftedness. Usually, ideas about being intellectually gifted are qualitatively different from those about being academically gifted. The two terms are not mutually exclusive, but they can be. Intellectually gifted kids are those with advanced or extreme cognitive capacities. They have the aptitude for learning, usually indicated by a high IQ score. In PA, as in most states, as we've said, that is 130 plus. By contrast, academically gifted kids are the ones who are remarkably comfortable and capable with putting on their thinking caps. They do well in school, mostly because they work hard, they play by the rules, and they succeed because they are quite determined to do so. Apparently, gifted kids typically stand out because of their high achievement test scores. Some definitions see talent as synonymous with giftedness, but others consider the terms gifted and talented to be two separate things. From the dual perspective, giftedness refers to cognitive aptitude and ability, usually defined by an IQ score, while the term talent refers to an individual who excels in a special practical area, such as music, art, or dance. Giftedness in terms of cognitive aptitude is measured by IQ tests, the range of which can be statistically plotted on the normal curve. Talent, on the other hand, is harder to measure because it reflects cultural values and ideals of creativity rather than quantifiable yes-no responses. Identification of talent is therefore more subjective and difficult to describe statistically. My interest is in ways that giftedness, based on intellectual aptitude, may manifest itself in the elementary classroom. Although it is no less important, for purposes of this study, I focus only tangentially on ways that talent, defined by practical applications of advanced creativity aspects, factors into cognitive capacity. In my school, the gifted kids sometimes look like Greg. They are, quote, high flyers, end quote. But more often they do not. Perhaps they look like Stephen. So I'm interested in the kids like that, the ones who are not the model students, and in fact may sometimes be underachievers or those who seem to be completely disconnected from the figured world of school. If I were to ask the person on the street, or for that matter, most of the parents and the teachers I know, what does a gifted kid look like? The response would likely include characteristics like good grades, high test scores, accelerated class load, full schedules, classroom leadership skills, etc., etc., etc. But an atypical gifted kid may or may not look like this, and may or may not be successful in school. He or she could be Stephen, one who exhibits broad and diverse thinking in spite of our efforts to define them more narrowly by the rules about academic achievement and school performance. And granted, it is an extreme example, but there are also the TEDs. Consider these famous thinkers, all of whom exhibited non-traditional aspects of giftedness, and certainly went on to make a rather dramatic impact in our world. Surprised by any? The Gregs are easy to see. The Stevens are a little bit more challenging to find, but obviously they're no less important to nurture. And although it may seem to be an extreme example, TEDs exist, and without intervention, their stories are tragic. So how prepared do elementary teachers feel to identify giftedness? How reliable are their perceptions? As educational and psychological thinkers have begun to acknowledge and explore the role of context and culture in learning, there is increasing evidence that most teachers do not recognize gifted students who don't conform to classroom rules and expectations or whose cultural backgrounds prompt them to approach learning in divergent ways. There is intriguing research pointing out the unintentional biases of our dominant culture in schooling and the strong influence that dominant culture has on the identification of gifted students, and actually the identification of students for remedial services. Interestingly, one of the criticisms of Terman's early work, first linking high IQ to giftedness, was that all the participants selected for his research study were first nominated by their teachers, potentially with this narrow dominant culture view. The school narrative of dominant culture has led to prevalent myths about the nature and appearance of giftedness. As I have read and researched and thought my own experiences through about how teachers and I do and do not identify giftedness, and how my work with my colleagues around the nomination process has hopefully impacted that, several particularly prevalent myths have begun to stand out. So before we go any further, let's debunk them. Myth: gifted kids get good grades. Now, this is the fundamental disconnect between academic achievement and intellectual aptitude. They may be mutually exclusive, they may not be, but don't assume. Myth: gifted kids score high on standardized achievement tests. The cultural bias inherent in many standardized tests tends to impact students from diverse or disadvantaged backgrounds. But the inability to perform on standardized testing is equally problematic. This can be due to a gifted kid's poorly developed executive functioning, time management skills, anxiety, or even their simple disengagement from what they perceive to be irrelevant academic exercises. Standardized achievement test scores may or may not be good indicators of a student's proficiency levels or academic achievements, but on their own, they certainly do not predict an individual's intellectual aptitude. The highest PSSA score may be that of a gifted child, but so could the lowest. Myth: gifted kids are model students. 3 names, 3 gifted kids: Greg, Stephen, Ted. Who were the model students? How did they turn out? Enough said. Myth: gifted kids demonstrate potential in school. Again, each gifted student is as unique and different as the next. If you reflect back on our 3 examples, you will see that 2, Greg and Ted, did demonstrate typical potential in school. The one that didn't, Stephen, certainly didn't lack in giftedness, or for that matter, potential. This is a staggering number. How can it be that almost 1/4 of those we might consider our best and brightest drop out of school? Statistics like this are indicative of the headline-making contention from the 1993 Federal National Excellence Report, which called the state of gifted education in the U.S., quote, a quiet crisis, end quote. Myth: gifted kids are the nerds. Maybe. They could be the glasses-wearing, chess-playing, math Olympiad science fair-going bunch, but they could also be the soccer stars, or the thespians, or the ice dancers. Some students are really uncomfortable with the denotation of being gifted at all. Others may resent the expectations that being identified or gifted put on them. I had one teacher tell me once, "I expect more from my gifted kids." Why? They're just kids. Being gifted may lead some kids to revel in their designation. Others might act out, while still more kids just desperately try to downplay their abilities just so that they can fit in with everyone else. Sometimes these kids lose their sense of self, and sometimes they become the ones we call underachievers. Again, kids are kids. Myth: gifted kids do not have learning issues. Just as gifted kids can be found among the nerds and the jocks, they are also part of every other population in our schools. Recent research has increasingly explored links between high IQ and autism, for instance. Of special note are some really interesting active HR programs created by corporations such as Microsoft. These actively recruit autistic individuals who often have exceedingly high visual spatial intelligences and would be far above the normal population on the gifted curve. Gifted kids are individuals. Each one has just as many layers to unwrap as any other child might. Myth: gifted kids tend to be more mature than the other kids in the class. Yeah, well, like Greg, some gifted kids display remarkable social and emotional maturity and extreme levels of empathy. Others don't. Gifted kids tend to exhibit a phenomenon called asynchronicity. That is a pretty significant disconnect between where they are in their cognitive or emotional development and where they are physically and or in other areas of their development. Of course, when it comes right down to it, gifted kids are still just kids. Myth: even if we don't identify them, gifted kids will get by fine in school. Ironically, this does tend to be true for academically gifted kids. These are the kids that are so attuned to the ways of being that school requires they can just regulate themselves to any classroom environment, one that typically teaches to the middle, or the top, or the bottom. They adjust their own learning accordingly. But intellectually gifted kids don't usually plug in like this. If they are not provided opportunities to realize their diverse learning styles, there are often negative academic, social, and emotional consequences. One of my favorite movies is a 1983 oldie called Teachers. In it, Nick Nolte, as an irreverent teacher and student advocate, reminds a disgruntled administrator that, quote, "the school wasn't built for us, it was built for them, the students," reminding educators like us not to fit square pegs into round holes. Instead, it's our job to recognize and to adjust to the kids' needs, not the other way around. Much of the core of gifted program design and most of the strategies we use for identification and nomination of students tend to be based on these myths. For that reason, especially given the demographics of my current school, which do not fit the model gifted child, I was interested in the kids I was serving, but more importantly, I was interested in the kids I was missing. Last year, I was brand new to my current position as gifted resource. When I told one of my colleagues the school at which I would be placed, she said blithely, "Oh, then, you have really small classes because Evans City just doesn't have very many gifted kids." Wait a minute, what? Look at the national and district statistics. Evans City had to have gifted kids. So why weren't they identified? Why didn't anybody know about them? Here's what's even more interesting. Approximately 15% of the district students have been identified as needing some form of learning support. But by contrast, over 25% of the students at Evans City have an IEP or a 504 plan. It would appear that our school is really good at recognizing and providing interventions for struggling learners. So why aren't we good about seeing students at the other end of the spectrum? Maybe we're just too caught up in the myths of giftedness to be looking for the right kinds of things. Consider the disparity between the school at which I teach and the district in which it is situated. Out of the 6 schools serving grades K through 12, my school, Evans City, is located in the area with the highest unemployment rate and the lowest overall socioeconomic status in the district. Statistics indicate that nationwide, kids from low-income families are dramatically underrepresented in gifted programs. Why? Research indicates that kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are often those that don't exhibit the characteristics typically considered as reflecting giftedness, those myths. Instead, they present in very different ways, and in fact, They tend to be the square pegs in our classrooms. I knew we had to have more kids at Evans City who were gifted, but given our numbers, I also knew that we didn't really understand how to see them or how to find them. So I set a goal for myself to research and understand some of the traits that non-traditional gifted kids might exhibit so that I could share them with the teachers who worked with them every day. And maybe we could find them. Some of the traits are those expected smart kid characteristics, but others are atypical ways that giftedness can look, especially among students from the lower socioeconomic levels with which I work. The next few slides present my emerging understandings about 15 traits of giftedness, arranged by category. The first 5 traits are those falling into the cognitive category. The symbol of the brain represents cognitive traits, those that are well linked to schooling and academic achievement, and thus the ones that tend to be easiest for us all to see. Gifted students often have a rate and pace of learning that is accelerated beyond that of their peers. They may understand new material more quickly, have high levels of language development and strong verbal abilities, and or learn things at a much earlier age than is developmentally typical. Another cognitive trait is that gifted learners often comprehend material at advanced levels, processing and or retaining large amounts of knowledge. They like to have freedom and individuality in deciding how to present their learning, and they typically prefer complex and or challenging tasks. Gifted students usually enjoy sharing their knowledge and ideas with others and seek out every opportunity to do so, especially during discussions. Gifted children are generally able to think abstractly at an earlier age than is typical, and they make cognitive connections easily. Often, they see unusual and often unexpected patterns between objects, ideas, or disciplines. They also tend to be able to easily transfer and to apply existing knowledge to new situations. Gifted children tend to be extremely curious, and they ask a lot of questions. They exhibit unusual flexible patterns of thought about topics, which often enables them to generate original ideas or insightful solutions for problems. Gifted kids tend to have varied interests in topics and activities, and sometimes these interests can be intense, almost hyper-focused. Some gifted children display great intellectual stamina. They are persistent, goal-oriented, and intense, especially in those areas that are of interest to them. They may be able to delay the completion of a project or a task. For these reasons, gifted kids often prefer to work alone rather than as part of a collaborative group. The second group of traits reflect the affective ways that giftedness may manifest itself. Although educators might often point to leadership as indicating giftedness, there are less obvious and more often overlooked affective characteristics of which we should be aware. Often, gifted children possess a lot of information about their own emotions and display unusual emotional depth or intensity. Sometimes this is focused on themselves, other times this is that ability to relate to others. Because gifted children possess sophisticated verbal skills in most cases, they often have a keen or acerbic sense of humor. They appreciate irony, sarcasm, figures of speech, and hyperbole, and they really enjoy complex riddles, jokes, puzzles, and puns. Sometimes an unmoderated sense of humor can lead a gifted child being considered the class clown. The well-developed emotional intelligence that many gifted kids possess grant them exceptional social awareness. They may be highly empathetic and have a deep-rooted sense of justice and fairness, which they internalize at an early age. Their advanced levels of moral judgment may make them seem self-righteous, but often their peers appreciate this strength as being one of leadership, especially in collaborative groupings. The term asynchronous development, as I mentioned earlier, describes the situation faced by the majority of gifted children. Because they are cognitively and/or socially advanced, they typically display a disconnect or a mismatch called asynchronicity between where they are in terms of their physical development and where they are in terms of their cognitive and/or social abilities or the behaviors that they exhibit. The last group of traits showcase some aspects of giftedness that don't necessarily correlate to doing school well. These are often overlooked by educators, and in fact, they are often thought of as behaviors that interfere with these students' abilities to function in classroom-friendly ways. Many of these are, ironically, the traits most common among disadvantaged kids. Curious about their cultures, gifted kids may exhibit a strong desire to learn as much as they can about their personal backgrounds, ethnicity, and cultures. They place high value on customs and traditions, and they often have a strong sense of pride or self-worth. Gifted kids' creative tendencies or spatial sense enables them to manipulate symbols or patterns with ease. Often they are unusually capable of constructing objects or representations, and they enjoy building projects. Legos are a gift to a gifted child. Gifted children may also have sophisticated abilities in one or more areas of the arts, such as being highly musical or being an outstanding visual artist. This is one of the traits where that delineation between giftedness and talent really blurs. Some gifted kids, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, possess an exceptionally mature worldview. They tend to be resilient, able to devise coping strategies for difficult circumstances at home, and they are creative personal or situational problem solvers. Often, these are the kids that take on adult roles in their families. As they think through problems, gifted kids often use divergent reasoning, and they may use analogy to create understandings. They are able to think procedurally and logically, and can be strong-willed or stubborn about their opinions or the rightness of the learning strategies they choose. Based upon their heightened sensitivity to others and to the goings-on of the world around them, gifted children may adopt a global perspective. They are curious about events taking place in their communities or across the world, sometimes closely following news, politics, and/or current events. So, even assuming a student is recognized as, nominated for, and/or screened, whether he's a typical gifted child or she is an atypical gifted child, how is that final determination about being, quote, gifted actually made? Who decides? What criteria is used? Given the nature of education in the USA, this is as contextually bound as manifestations of giftedness itself. In general, each state establishes benchmarks for qualifications in gifted programs, correlates standards for gifted programs and gifted students to general state norms, and establishes teacher licensure requirement for gifted educators. Specific programs and curricula for gifted students are determined and administered at the district level. Most states accept the NAGC, or National Association of Gifted Children, delineation of a gifted IQ, a score of 130 plus, often plotted on a qualification matrix along with data from other measures and sources. Although not intended to be any kind of comprehensive list of screenings and assessments, what you see here is a partial list of the tools in use now or in the recent past at my own school district. If time permits, I will delve more deeply into each of these tools to explore the history, reliability, and validity of each. I also plan, if possible, to overview the process of giftedness in my school district, from identification to nomination to qualification, especially including how the various data collected is plotted into our own gifted matrix. Because it is already quite extensive, a reference list for this presentation and for my larger research paper to follow will be posted as a separate document. Please feel free, however, to reach out to me with any questions you may have, or if you'd like additional information about any aspect of this presentation. Thanks so much for your time and attention. As you can probably tell, this study was a labor of love. I adore my current position, and I love the fact I have the chance to work with this very special and very eclectic population of square pegs. I feel fortunate every day to have returned to the classroom in this permutation. Thanks again.